Hello everyone, before we begin tonight's haunting tale, make sure to like this video and subscribe to the channel so you never miss a moment of the fear. Let us know in the comments where you're watching from and what time the unknown feels closest to you. The sprawling campus of Blackwood University was a patchwork of modern amenities and Gothic architecture, its ivy-clad walls exuding an air of history and mystery. Jake Rivers, a freshman from a small suburban town, stood at the entrance of the dormitory that would be his home for the next year. The building, with its towering spires and intricate stone carvings, looked more like a medieval castle than a college residence. "This place is insane," Jake muttered to himself, dragging his suitcase up the steps. The nameplate above the double oak doors read Winchester Hall, its letters carved in an ornate script that matched the overall aesthetic of the campus. Inside, the halls were dimly lit, the faint scent of aged wood and varnish lingering in the air. Students bustled about, carrying boxes and chatting excitedly as they settled into their new rooms. Jake's assigned room was at the end of the second floor, room 42. The number was etched into a bronze plaque, its edges worn smooth by time. He unlocked the door with a faint creak and stepped inside. The room was larger than he had expected, with high ceilings, a single tall window, and antique wooden furniture that looked like it had been there for decades. He set his suitcase down and took in his surroundings. The floorboards creaked slightly underfoot, and the air felt cooler than in the hallway. A faint draft slipped through the gaps in the window pane, causing the sheer curtains to flutter. "Well, it's not exactly cozy," Jake said aloud, trying to mask his unease. "But it'll do." As the day wore on, Jake unpacked and met some of his dorm neighbors. Across the hall lived Priya Patel, a cheerful and talkative sophomore majoring in psychology. Next door was Elliot Green, a reserved but friendly engineering student who seemed to know his way around the campus already. "You got room 42, huh?" Priya said when Jake mentioned his room number. Her smile faltered for a moment before she quickly recovered. "That's cool. It's a nice room." Jake raised an eyebrow. "Why do I feel like there's more to that?" Elliot smirked. "Room 42 has a bit of a reputation. People say it's weird." "Weird how?" Jake asked, his curiosity piqued. Priya hesitated, glancing at Elliot before responding. "It's probably just rumors, but some people who've stayed there said they heard things. Whispers, knocking, stuff like that. A few claimed they saw shadows that didn't belong to anything." Elliot shrugged. "It's an old building. Old buildings make noise. And shadows. Probably just bad lighting." Jake chuckled nervously. "Well, let's hope it's just the pipes and flickering lights. I don't need any haunted dorm room drama in my life." That night, as Jake settled into bed, he couldn't shake the conversation from his mind. The room was quiet, save for the occasional groan of the floorboards and the distant hum of a heater. He tried to dismiss his unease, chalking it up to first-day jitters. But then he heard it. A faint, rhythmic knocking. It seemed to come from the wall near his desk. Jake froze, straining to listen. The knocking stopped, replaced by a soft whisper that he couldn't quite make out. "Hello," Jake called out, his voice breaking the stillness. The room remained silent. He got up, checked the wall, and even opened the closet door, but there was nothing there. "Get it together, Jake," he muttered, climbing back into bed. He turned off the light and pulled the covers up to his chin, willing himself to sleep. But the knocking returned, softer this time, as if it were right next to his ear. The next morning, Jake shared his experience with Priya and Elliot. Priya's eyes widened as she listened. "That's exactly what people said before. The knocking, the whispers, it's always the same." Elliot, ever the skeptic, shrugged. "It's probably just the pipes or the wind. Old buildings do that." Jake frowned. "I don't think it was just the pipes. It sounded deliberate. Like someone was trying to get my attention." Priya leaned forward, lowering her voice. "Did you check the closet? People say that's where the weirdest stuff happens." Jake nodded. "Yeah, it was empty." "Still, it wouldn't hurt to keep an eye on things," Priya said. "You know, just in case." Elliot rolled his eyes. "Or you could just get some earplugs and not let it freak you out." Jake tried to follow Elliot's advice, But the strange occurrences continued over the next few nights. The whispers grew louder, forming words he couldn't quite understand. Objects in the room seemed to move on their own, a pen rolling off the desk, a chair shifting slightly out of place. The air felt heavier, colder, as if the room itself were alive. One night, Jake woke to find the closet door ajar, though he was certain he had closed it before going to bed. A faint glow emanated from within, and for a split second, he thought he saw a figure standing inside, a pale outline with hollow eyes. He blinked, and it was gone. The next morning, Jake confided in Priya and Elliot again. This time, even Elliot seemed uneasy. "Maybe there's more to these stories than I thought," he admitted. "But if it's bothering you that much, you should talk to someone. Maybe the RA or maintenance." Priya shook her head. "I don't think maintenance can fix this. If what people say is true, room 42 has been like this for years. There's a reason no one stays there for long. Underscore 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 underscore. Desperate for answers, Jake decided to do some digging. He started with the campus library, searching for any mention of Winchester Hall or room 42. The librarian, Mrs. Duval, raised an eyebrow when he explained what he was looking for. "You're not the first student to ask about that room," she said. "Winchester Hall has quite the history. It was built over the remains of an old boarding school that burned down in the late 1800s. They say some of the students and staff never made it out." Jake felt a chill run down his spine. "Do you have any records from the boarding school?" Mrs. Duval led him to the archives, where she pulled out a dusty box labeled Blackwood Boarding School. Inside were faded photographs, handwritten ledgers, and old newspaper clippings. One article caught Jake's eye. "Mysterious disappearance at Blackwood Boarding School. Dated March 12, 1879. Lydia Harlow, a promising young student, vanished without a trace last week. Despite extensive searches, no clues to her whereabouts have been found. Some claim to hear her voice echoing through the halls at night, calling for help." The school's headmistress declined to comment. Jake's hands trembled as he read the article. Lydia Harlow. Could she be the one haunting room 42? Underscore 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 underscore. Jake shared his findings with Priya and Elliot that evening. Priya was intrigued, but Elliot looked uneasy. "If this Lydia girl really disappeared, and her voice has been heard, do you think she's still in there? Like, her spirit?" Jake shrugged. "I don't know. But if she is, maybe she's trying to tell us something." Priya nodded. "We need to dig deeper. There has to be more to this story." Elliot sighed. "Fine. But if something weird happens, I'm out." The three of them resolved to uncover the truth about Lydia Harlow and the haunting of room 42, unaware of just how deep the mystery would go. Jake couldn't shake the feeling that Lydia Harlow's story was the key to everything happening in room 42. The whispers, the strange movements, the cold drafts, all of it seemed to tie back to the disappearance of a girl from over a century ago. But why? What was she trying to communicate? And why room 42? Priya, ever the researcher, suggested they explore deeper into the archives. "There has to be more," she said, scrolling through the university's online database one afternoon in her dorm room. "If she disappeared, there might have been an investigation. Someone had to document what happened after she went missing." Elliot leaned against the desk, looking skeptical but intrigued. "And what if we don't find anything? This could all just be, I don't know, the wind and creaky floorboards messing with us." Priya shot him a look. "The wind didn't write 'help me' on the mirror, Elliot." Jake nodded in agreement. "We need to find out what happened to her." Maybe then we can figure out why she's still here. The next morning, the trio met at the campus library, armed with notepads, laptops, and a renewed determination. Mrs. Duval, the librarian, greeted them warmly and offered access to a restricted section of the archives containing old records from the boarding school era. These documents are fragile, she warned, placing a stack of aged files on the table. Handle them carefully. Jake flipped through the brittle pages, his eyes scanning for anything related to Lydia. Most of the records were mundane enrollment logs, maintenance requests, and financial ledgers. But then he found something, a faded letter written by the headmistress of Blackwood boarding school to a local reverend. Reverend Prescott, I write to seek your guidance regarding a troubling matter. One of our students, Lydia Harlow, has been engaging in peculiar behaviors. She claims to hear voices and speaks of a presence within her dormitory room. I fear these delusions may be spreading, as other students have begun reporting similar disturbances. I request your counsel on how to proceed, for the safety of all. _ Jake read the letter aloud, his voice tinged with both excitement and unease. She was hearing the whispers, just like me. Priya leaned closer, her brow furrowed. And it sounds like it wasn't just her. If other students were affected, maybe this isn't just about Lydia. Elliot tapped the table thoughtfully. What if she wasn't imagining it? What if something was already there, something she accidentally woke up? As they delved further into the archives, they uncovered more disturbing details. A student journal from the same time period described nightly rituals Lydia performed in her room, which happened to be located where room 42 now stood. The entries were frantic and disjointed. She says the voices can be appeased, that they will answer if we ask the right questions. Last night, she drew strange symbols on the floor and lit a single candle. I swear, for a moment, the air itself seemed to hum. But then the shadows grew darker, and Lydia, she smiled, but it wasn't her smile. Priya sat back, her expression grim. She was trying to communicate with whatever was in the room. And it sounds like it didn't end well. Jake felt a chill run down his spine. What if she's trapped because of what she did? What if the whispers are her way of asking for help? Elliot sighed, running a hand through his hair. And what if helping her makes things worse? What if we end up waking whatever she was messing with? That night, Jake returned to room 42 with a sense of unease. He had left the journal and documents with Priya for safekeeping, but the weight of what they had uncovered lingered heavily in his mind. As he sat at his desk, trying to focus on his homework, the whispers began again. This time, they were louder, more distinct. The words seemed to form a pattern, though he couldn't quite make them out. He turned toward the closet, where the sound seemed to originate, and froze. The door was ajar, though he was certain he had closed it. "Lydia," Jake whispered, his voice shaking. "Is that you?" The whispers stopped abruptly, replaced by an eerie silence. Then, the closet door creaked open wider, revealing the faint outline of a figure. Jake's breath caught as the figure stepped forward, its features becoming clearer in the dim light. It was a girl, her face pale and her eyes hollow. She wore an old-fashioned dress, its fabric tattered and burned at the edges. Her lips moved, but no sound came out. Jake scrambled backward, his heart pounding. "What do you want?" he stammered. The figure raised a hand, pointing toward the desk. Jake turned to see Lydia's journal, which he had left there earlier. When he looked back, the figure was gone. Jake didn't sleep that night. The next morning, he met Priya and Elliot at the campus cafe, his face pale and drawn. "She appeared," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Lydia. Or her ghost, or whatever she is." She pointed to the journal. Priya's eyes widened. "She's trying to tell us something. Maybe the journal has answers we missed." Elliot frowned. "Or maybe she's leading us into a trap. How do we know we can trust her?" Jake shook his head. "I don't know. But I can't just ignore her." They spent the day poring over Lydia's journal, searching for anything they might have overlooked. Near the back, they found a page that had been stuck to the binding. It contained a series of symbols and instructions for a ritual, with a single phrase written in bold letters at the bottom. "To free the voice, light the way." "What does that mean?" Priya asked, tracing the symbols with her finger. Jake stared at the page, his mind racing. I think it's a way to communicate with her. To let her tell us what happened. Elliot sighed. And let me guess. You want to try it? Priya nodded slowly. If we're going to understand what's happening in room 42, we need to know her story. This might be the only way. That evening, the trio gathered in room 42, preparing to perform the ritual. They followed the instructions from Lydia's journal, arranging candles in a circle on the floor and drawing the symbols with chalk. The air in the room felt heavy, charged with an energy that made their skin prickle. As the clock struck midnight, Jake lit the candles and began reciting the words written in the journal. His voice trembled, but he pressed on, his friends watching nervously from the edges of the circle. At first, nothing happened. The room remained still, the candles flickering softly. But then, the temperature dropped sharply, and the shadows in the room began to shift. The whispers returned, louder and more distinct than ever. A faint glow appeared in the center of the circle, and slowly, the figure of Lydia materialized. She looked more solid than before, her features clearer. Her eyes, though still hollow, seemed filled with a desperate sadness. Lydia, Jake said softly, we want to help you. Can you tell us what happened? Her lips moved, and this time, they could hear her voice. It was faint, like a breeze through the trees, but the words were unmistakable. I made a mistake. I let it in. And now, I can't leave. The candles flickered violently, and the shadows around the room seemed to grow darker. Lydia's form wavered, her voice rising in urgency. You have to stop it. Before it's too late. The light in the circle flared, and Lydia vanished, leaving the room in darkness. The trio sat in stunned silence, the weight of her words pressing heavily on them. What did she mean? Priya asked, her voice trembling. Stop what? Jake looked at the journal, its pages now glowing faintly. Whatever she let in, it's still here. And it's not just haunting this room. It's growing stronger. Elliot swallowed hard. So what do we do now? Jake met his gaze, determination flickering in his eyes. We finish what Lydia started. We stop it. And with that, the stage was set for the battle to uncover the truth and confront the darkness lurking within room 42. The sun rose the next morning, but it brought no comfort to Jake, Priya, and Elliot. The events of the previous night played over and over in their minds, Lydia's desperate warning echoing in the silence of their thoughts. Jake sat at his desk, staring at Lydia's journal, its cryptic symbols and ominous instructions demanding his attention. He couldn't shake the feeling that time was running out. What do we even do next? Elliot asked when the three of them reconvened in Priya's dorm room later that morning. His usually calm demeanor was replaced by a nervous edge. We barely got through that ritual, and now we're supposed to stop, whatever it is. Priya tapped her pen against her notebook, where she had jotted down every detail of Lydia's warning. She said we have to stop it. But she didn't say how. Maybe the answer is still in the journal. Or maybe there's something else we haven't found yet. Jake leaned forward, his fingers brushing the worn edges of the journal. We need to understand what she was trying to do in the first place. Why was she performing those rituals? What did she think she was summoning? Elliot sighed. Great. More research. Because that's gone so well for us so far. Priya ignored him, pulling out her laptop. Let's start with the symbols in the journal. If Lydia copied them from somewhere, they might match something in one of the university's archives or even online. Hours passed as the trio pored over old texts and digital records, searching for anything that matched the intricate symbols scrawled in Lydia's journal. Priya cross-referenced them with ancient languages, occult practices, and historical documents from the time of the boarding school. Slowly, a pattern began to emerge. These symbols, Priya said, pointing to a page in the journal, they're similar to ones used in ancient binding rituals. They were meant to trap spirits or entities, to keep them from escaping into the physical world. Jake frowned. But why would Lydia be trying to bind something? Did she summon it first? Or was it already there? Priya shook her head. I don't know. But if she was trying to bind it, it means she knew it was dangerous. Maybe it's been here all along, and she just woke it up. Elliot leaned back in his chair, his arms crossed. So what you're saying is, we're dealing with something that's been lurking here for over a century. Something Lydia couldn't stop, and now it's stronger than ever. Pretty much, Priya said. But at least now we know what we're up against. If these symbols are part of a binding ritual, there might be a way to use them to strengthen whatever seal she created. Jake nodded, determination hardening his expression. Then we need to find out how to complete it. That evening, the trio decided to visit the janitor, Mr. Whitaker, who had worked at Blackwood University for decades. He was known for his encyclopedic knowledge of the campus and its history, and Jake suspected he might know more about Winchester Hall than he let on. They found him in the basement of the dormitory, repairing an old radiator. He looked up as they approached, wiping his hands on a rag. "Well, if it isn't the ghost hunters," he said with a chuckle. "What brings you down here?" Jake hesitated before speaking. "We need to know more about room 42. About the boarding school, Lydia Harlow, and whatever's happening there now." Mr. Whitaker's expression darkened. "I figured you'd come asking eventually. You're not the first students to poke around that room, you know. And you won't be the last." "What happened there?" Priya asked. "Why is it so different?" The janitor sighed, setting down his tools. Winchester Hall was built on the ruins of the old boarding school, like you probably already know. But what most people don't realize is that the fire that destroyed the school wasn't an accident. It started in Lydia's room. Some say she caused it. Others think she was trying to stop something from getting out. "Getting out?" Elliot repeated, his voice rising. "You mean like an entity?" Mr. Whitaker nodded slowly. "I don't know what she did, but whatever it was, it left a mark. That room has been wrong ever since. People hear things, see things. Some say it's Lydia's spirit. Others think it's something worse." Jake felt a chill run down his spine. "Do you think it can be stopped?" The janitor studied them for a long moment before answering. "Maybe. But if you're serious about trying, you need to be careful. Messing with that room has a way of changing people." Armed with Mr. Whitaker's warning and the fragments of information they had gathered, the trio returned to room 42. They set up their equipment, cameras, voice recorders, and a notebook to document everything that happened. The air felt heavier as they stepped inside, the temperature noticeably dropping. Jake placed the journal on the desk, opening it to the page with the symbols. "If we're going to figure this out, we need to retrace her steps. Perform the rituals she started, but do it right this time." "Define right," Elliot said, his voice tinged with sarcasm. "Because last time we tried something like this, we almost got swallowed by shadows." Priya shot him a look. "We're not jumping into anything blindly. First, we observe. If the symbols are part of a binding ritual, they might react to the energy in the room. We'll start small and see what happens." They arranged candles in a circle around the symbols, following Lydia's instructions as closely as possible. Jake lit the candles, their flickering flames casting long shadows across the walls. The trio sat in silence, waiting for something to happen. At first, the room was still. Then, the whispers began. They were faint, almost imperceptible, but they grew steadily louder. The symbols on the floor seemed to shimmer, their edges glowing faintly in the candlelight. "Do you see that?" Priya whispered, her eyes wide. Jake nodded, his heart pounding. "It's reacting. Just like the journal said." The whispers coalesced into a single voice, low and guttural. It spoke in a language none of them recognized, but the tone was unmistakably hostile. The candles flickered violently, and the shadows on the walls began to twist and writhe. "Is this supposed to happen?" Elliot asked, his voice rising in panic. "I don't know," Priya said. "It's not in the journal." The voice grew louder, its words reverberating through the room. The symbols on the floor flared brightly, and the air filled with a palpable sense of malice. Jake grabbed the journal, frantically flipping through the pages. "We need to end this," he said, his voice shaking. "Blow out the candles." The trio scrambled to extinguish the flames, their movements frantic. As the last candle was snuffed out, the room plunged into darkness. The voice faded, leaving only the sound of their ragged breathing. When Jake turned on his flashlight, The symbols on the floor had disappeared, leaving only faint scorch marks behind. The air was heavy with the scent of burnt wax and something acrid, almost metallic. What the hell was that? Elliot demanded, his face pale. Jake shook his head. I don't know. But whatever it was, it's not bound anymore. Priya's voice was barely above a whisper. We made it worse. The three of them stood in silence, the weight of their mistake pressing heavily on them. Whatever Lydia had tried to contain was now free, and they had no idea how to stop it. The trio sat in silence in Jake's dorm room the morning after their harrowing encounter in room 42. The dim light filtering through the window did little to lift the heavy atmosphere that clung to them. Priya flipped through Lydia's journal, her brow furrowed in concentration, while Elliot slouched in the corner, his arms crossed tightly over his chest. Jake, seated at his desk, stared blankly at the symbols they had hastily redrawn on a piece of paper, their meaning as elusive as ever. We can't keep doing this, Elliot finally said, breaking the tense silence. Every time we try something, it gets worse. How long before one of us ends up like Lydia? Priya looked up sharply. We're not going to end up like Lydia. That's why we're doing this, to figure out what she was trying to stop and finish what she started. Elliot let out a bitter laugh. Oh, sure. Because it's worked so well so far. Jake's voice was quiet but firm. We don't have a choice. If we walk away, this thing will only get stronger. It's not just about us anymore. Elliot opened his mouth to argue but closed it again when he saw the determination in Jake's eyes. Instead, he sighed and ran a hand through his hair. Fine. But I'm telling you, the next time something lunges at me, I'm out. Underscore 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 underscore. Determined to find answers, the trio returned to the library to comb through the collection of folklore and records Mrs. Duval had shown them. They worked tirelessly, sifting through faded documents and obscure texts in search of anything that could shed light on Lydia's rituals and the entity haunting room 42. After hours of fruitless searching, Priya stumbled across an entry in an old book on regional occult practices. The page detailed a ritual known as the Binding of Shadows, designed to trap malevolent entities within a confined space. Listen to this, Priya said, her voice tinged with excitement. The Binding of Shadows requires the use of sigils to anchor the entity, along with a conduit to channel its energy. The binding must be performed under specific conditions when the veil between realms is thinnest. Jake leaned over to read the passage. A conduit. That must be what Lydia was trying to use. But what does it mean by the veil being thinnest? Priya flipped to the next page, scanning the text. It's talking about liminal times, like midnight or during certain celestial events. Basically, when the boundaries between our world and wherever these things come from are weakest. Elliot frowned. And let me guess, it's going to say we need to perform this ritual at midnight, right? Because nothing creepy ever happens in broad daylight. Priya ignored him and continued reading. There's more. Should the binding be incomplete, the entity will grow more powerful, feeding on the fear of those who disturb it. She looked up, her expression grim. That explains why it's getting stronger. Lydia's ritual failed, and now it's feeding on us. Jake's jaw tightened. Then we have to finish it. We have to complete the binding and stop it for good. Underscore 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 underscore. Later that evening, they gathered in Priya's room to formulate a plan. They sketched out the sigils from Lydia's journal and the occult book, cross-referencing them to ensure their accuracy. They also compiled a list of supplies, candles, salt, mirrors, and iron, all items mentioned in various texts as being effective against malevolent spirits. We need to be precise, Priya said as she carefully copied one of the sigils onto a piece of parchment. If even one of these symbols is drawn wrong, it could backfire. Elliot glanced at the growing pile of supplies on the desk. And what happens if it backfires? Does it? I don't know, eat us. Priya shot him an annoyed look. It won't backfire if we're careful. That's why we're planning everything out now. Jake looked at the clock. It was nearly 10 p.m. We should go back to room 42 and set everything up. The sooner we start, the better. Underscore 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 underscore. The air in room 42 was heavier than ever, the oppressive atmosphere wrapping around them like a suffocating blanket. The trio worked quickly, arranging the sigils in a circle on the floor and surrounding them with a protective ring of salt. They positioned mirrors at 4 points around the room, each angled to reflect the central circle. As the clock neared midnight, Jake lit the candles, their flickering flames casting eerie shadows across the walls. Priya stood just outside the salt circle, holding Lydia's journal, while Elliot positioned himself near the door, his flashlight clutched tightly in one hand. Are we ready? Jake asked, his voice steady despite the knot of fear tightening in his chest. Priya nodded. Just remember, stay inside the circle no matter what. The salt will protect you as long as it remains unbroken. Jake took a deep breath and began reciting the chant. The words felt heavier this time, as if each syllable carried a weight of its own. The room grew colder with each line, and the flickering candlelight seemed to dim. The sigils began to glow, their lines pulsing with an otherworldly light. The mirrors vibrated slightly, their surfaces rippling as though they were made of water. The whispers returned, louder and more insistent, echoing from every corner of the room. Suddenly, a deafening roar shook the walls, and the dark shape from before materialized in the center of the circle. It was larger now, its edges sharper and more defined. Its glowing eyes burned with a malevolent intensity as it stared down at Jake. Keep going, Priya shouted, her voice barely audible over the roar. The ritual is working. Jake pressed on, his voice rising to match the entity's fury. The sigils flared brighter, and the mirrors began to crack under the pressure. The entity thrashed violently, its tendrils lashing out at the protective circle. One of the tendrils struck the salt line, scattering a small section of it. The entity surged forward, its form pressing against the weakened barrier. Fix the circle, Priya screamed. Elliot scrambled to grab the bag of salt, his hands shaking as he poured a new line to seal the gap. The entity roared in frustration, recoiling as the barrier was restored. It's too strong, Elliot shouted. We're not going to make it. Yes, we are, Jake yelled, his voice cracking with determination. He recited the final lines of the chant, pouring every ounce of strength he had into the words. The sigils flared one last time, and a blinding light erupted from the circle. The entity let out a piercing scream as its form began to unravel, its tendrils disintegrating into wisps of shadow. The mirrors shattered, and the room fell silent. Underscore 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 underscore. When the light faded, the trio found themselves alone in the room. The sigils on the floor were gone, and the air felt lighter, as if a great weight had been lifted. Jake collapsed to his knees, his breath ragged. Did we do it? Elliot asked, his voice trembling. Priya looked around, her eyes scanning the room for any sign of the entity. I think it's gone. Jake stared at the empty space where the entity had been, a mixture of relief and exhaustion washing over him. We stopped it. At least for now. But even as the words left his mouth, a nagging sense of unease lingered. The entity was gone, but the room's history and Lydia's sacrifice remained a haunting reminder of the darkness they had faced. And Jake couldn't shake the feeling that their fight might not be over yet. The trio sat in silence in Jake's dorm room the morning after their harrowing encounter in room 42. The dim light filtering through the window did little to lift the heavy atmosphere that clung to them. Priya flipped through Lydia's journal, her brow furrowed in concentration, while Elliot slouched in the corner, his arms crossed tightly over his chest. Jake, seated at his desk, stared blankly at the symbols they had hastily redrawn on a piece of paper, their meaning as elusive as ever. "We can't keep doing this," Elliot finally said, breaking the tense silence. "Every time we try something, it gets worse. How long before one of us ends up like Lydia?" Priya looked up sharply. "We're not going to end up like Lydia. That's why we're doing this, to figure out what she was trying to stop and finish what she started." Elliot let out a bitter laugh. "Oh, sure. Because it's worked so well so far." Jake's voice was quiet but firm. "We don't have a choice. If we walk away, this thing will only get stronger. It's not just about us anymore." Elliot opened his mouth to argue but closed it again when he saw the determination in Jake's eyes. Instead, he sighed and ran a hand through his hair. "Fine. But I'm telling you, the next time something lunges at me, I'm out. Underscore 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 underscore. Determined to find answers, the trio returned to the library to comb through the collection of folklore and records Mrs. Duval had shown them. They worked tirelessly, sifting through faded documents and obscure texts in search of anything that could shed light on Lydia's rituals and the entity haunting room 42. After hours of fruitless searching, Priya stumbled across an entry in an old book on regional occult practices. The page detailed a ritual known as the Binding of Shadows, designed to trap malevolent entities within a confined space. "Listen to this," Priya said, her voice tinged with excitement. "The Binding of Shadows requires the use of sigils to anchor the entity, along with a conduit to channel its energy. The binding must be performed under specific conditions when the veil between realms is thinnest." Jake leaned over to read the passage. "A conduit. That must be what Lydia was trying to use. But what does it mean by the veil being thinnest?" Priya flipped to the next page, scanning the text. "It's talking about liminal times, like midnight or during certain celestial events. Basically, when the boundaries between our world and wherever these things come from are weakest." Elliot frowned. "And let me guess, it's going to say we need to perform this ritual at midnight, right? Because nothing creepy ever happens in broad daylight." Priya ignored him and continued reading. "There's more. Should the binding be incomplete, the entity will grow more powerful, feeding on the fear of those who disturb it." She looked up, her expression grim. "That explains why it's getting stronger. Lydia's ritual failed, and now it's feeding on us." Jake's jaw tightened. "Then we have to finish it. We have to complete the binding and stop it for good." Underscore 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 underscore. Later that evening, they gathered in Priya's room to formulate a plan. They sketched out the sigils from Lydia's journal and the occult book, cross-referencing them to ensure their accuracy. They also compiled a list of supplies: candles, salt, mirrors, and iron, all items mentioned in various texts as being effective against malevolent spirits. "We need to be precise," Priya said as she carefully copied one of the sigils onto a piece of parchment. "If even one of these symbols is drawn wrong, it could backfire." Elliot glanced at the growing pile of supplies on the desk. "And what happens if it backfires? Does it?" "I don't know, eat us." Priya shot him an annoyed look. "It won't backfire if we're careful. That's why we're planning everything out now." Jake looked at the clock. It was nearly 10 p.m. We should go back to room 42 and set everything up. The sooner we start, the better. Underscore 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 underscore. The air in room 42 was heavier than ever, the oppressive atmosphere wrapping around them like a suffocating blanket. The trio worked quickly, arranging the sigils in a circle on the floor and surrounding them with a protective ring of salt. They positioned mirrors at 4 points around the room, each angled to reflect the central circle. As the clock neared midnight, Jake lit the candles, their flickering flames casting eerie shadows across the walls. Priya stood just outside the salt circle, holding Lydia's journal, while Elliot positioned himself near the door, his flashlight clutched tightly in one hand. "Are we ready?" Jake asked, his voice steady despite the knot of fear tightening in his chest. Priya nodded. "Just remember, stay inside the circle no matter what. The salt will protect you as long as it remains unbroken." Jake took a deep breath and began reciting the chant. The words felt heavier this time, as if each syllable carried a weight of its own. The room grew colder with each line, and the flickering candlelight seemed to dim. The sigils began to glow, their lines pulsing with an otherworldly light. The mirrors vibrated slightly, their surfaces rippling as though they were made of water. The whispers returned, louder and more insistent, echoing from every corner of the room. Suddenly, a deafening roar shook the walls, and the dark shape from before materialized in the center of the circle. It was larger now, its edges sharper and more defined. Its glowing eyes burned with a malevolent intensity as it stared down at Jake. "Keep going," Priya shouted, her voice barely audible over the roar. "The ritual is working." Jake pressed on, his voice rising to match the entity's fury. The sigils flared brighter, and the mirrors began to crack under the pressure. The entity thrashed violently, its tendrils lashing out at the protective circle. One of the tendrils struck the salt line, scattering a small section of it. The entity surged forward, its form pressing against the weakened barrier. "Fix the circle," Priya screamed. Elliot scrambled to grab the bag of salt, his hands shaking as he poured a new line to seal the gap. The entity roared in frustration, recoiling as the barrier was restored. "It's too strong," Elliot shouted. "We're not going to make it." "Yes, we are," Jake yelled, his voice cracking with determination. He recited the final lines of the chant, pouring every ounce of strength he had into the words. The sigils flared one last time, and a blinding light erupted from the circle. The entity let out a piercing scream as its form began to unravel, its tendrils disintegrating into wisps of shadow. The mirrors shattered, and the room fell silent. Underscore 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 underscore. When the light faded, the trio found themselves alone in the room. The sigils on the floor were gone, and the air felt lighter, as if a great weight had been lifted. Jake collapsed to his knees, his breath ragged. "Did we do it?" Elliot asked, his voice trembling. Priya looked around, her eyes scanning the room for any sign of the entity. I think it's gone." Jake stared at the empty space where the entity had been, a mixture of relief and exhaustion washing over him. "We stopped it. At least for now." But even as the words left his mouth, a nagging sense of unease lingered. The entity was gone, but the room's history and Lydia's sacrifice remained a haunting reminder of the darkness they had faced. And Jake couldn't shake the feeling that their fight might not be over yet. The oppressive silence in room 42 was shattered the moment Jake, Priya, and Elliot returned. This time, there was no pretense of calm, the air was heavy with an undeniable sense of foreboding. The trio had prepared as best they could, but the weight of what they were about to face hung over them like a storm cloud. Jake stood in the center of the room, Lydia's journal clutched tightly in his hands. The familiar sigils they had painstakingly recreated glowed faintly on the floor, pulsing with a steady rhythm that mirrored his racing heartbeat. Priya busied herself with setting up additional layers of protection, rings of salt, iron nails placed at strategic points, and mirrors positioned to reflect any movement. Elliot paced near the door, his flashlight clutched tightly in one hand and a crowbar in the other. "I hate this," Elliot muttered. "Every time we come in here, it feels worse. Like the room knows what we're about to do." "It probably does," Priya said without looking up from her work. "If the entity is as tied to this space as we think, it's aware of everything happening here." Jake exhaled deeply, his eyes fixed on the glowing sigils. "Then let's give it something to think about." The plan was simple in theory: complete the binding ritual they had started in the chapel basement, but this time within room 42 itself. The room, they believed, was the heart of the entity's presence, the point where it was strongest and most vulnerable. They had reinforced the sigils, added more layers of protection, and memorized every line of the ritual chant. But even with their preparations, doubt gnawed at the edges of their resolve. As midnight approached, the atmosphere in the room grew heavier, the temperature plummeting despite the warm autumn night outside. The candles placed around the sigils flickered violently, their flames bending as if pushed by an invisible wind. The whispers returned, louder and more insistent than ever, filling the room with a cacophony of disembodied voices. "It's starting," Priya said, her voice steady but tense. "Jake, get into position." Jake nodded and stepped into the circle, careful not to disturb the salt line. He opened Lydia's journal to the marked page, his fingers trembling slightly as he began to recite the chant. The ancient words flowed from his lips, sharp and rhythmic, each syllable reverberating through the room like a strike of thunder. The sigils flared to life, their light casting eerie shadows across the walls. The whispers grew louder, merging into a single, guttural voice that seemed to emanate from the very walls of the room. "You dare bind me," the voice boomed, shaking the floor beneath their feet. The shadows on the walls began to shift and coalesce, forming the dark, amorphous shape they had encountered before. This time, it was larger, more defined, its glowing eyes burning with an intensity that made Jake's chest tighten. "Stay inside the circle," Priya shouted, her own voice barely audible over the roar. She began her part of the ritual, chanting a secondary incantation meant to reinforce the protective barrier. The entity lunged at the circle, its tendrils slamming against the invisible wall created by the salt and sigils. Sparks of energy erupted at the point of contact, forcing the entity back with a howl of rage. Elliot swung his crowbar at a tendril that had snaked too close, the metal passing through it harmlessly but scattering the shadowy form momentarily. "What's the plan if this thing breaks through?" he yelled. "Don't let it," Priya snapped, her focus unwavering. "Just keep it at bay until Jake finishes." Jake's voice rose, carrying the chant over the chaos erupting around him. The sigils pulsed brighter, their light growing almost blinding. The room trembled violently, and cracks began to form in the walls, releasing a chilling wind that smelled of decay and earth. The entity roared, its form shifting and expanding as it pressed harder against the barrier. Its glowing eyes locked onto Jake, and for a moment, he felt an overwhelming wave of dread wash over him. Images flashed through his mind, Lydia's face twisted in fear, the chapel engulfed in flames, and a void of infinite darkness reaching out to consume everything. "Jake!" Priya's voice snapped him back to the present. "Don't stop." Gritting his teeth, Jake pushed through the fear and continued the chant. The journal's pages glowed faintly in his hands, as if feeding off the energy in the room. The words seemed to take on a life of their own, flowing from him with a force he could barely control. The entity lashed out again, this time focusing its attacks on the mirrors positioned around the room. One by one, the mirrors shattered, their shards scattering across the floor. The loss of the reflective barriers weakened the protective circle, and the entity surged forward, its tendrils wrapping around the edge of the salt line. "It's breaking through," Elliot shouted, his voice tinged with panic. Priya grabbed the remaining bag of salt and quickly reinforced the circle, her movements frantic. "Just a little longer," she yelled. "We're almost there." As the ritual neared its climax, The entity let out a piercing scream that seemed to reverberate through their very bones. The shadows in the room grew darker, thicker, until it felt as though they were standing in the void itself. The temperature dropped further, and frost began to form on the walls and floor. Jake's chant reached its final stanza, the words spilling from him with a power he couldn't explain. The sigils on the floor flared brighter than ever, their light piercing through the oppressive darkness. The entity writhed and thrashed, its form beginning to unravel at the edges. "Now," Priya shouted. "Finish it." Jake recited the final line, his voice ringing out like a bell. The sigils erupted in a burst of light, and the entity let out a final, ear-splitting roar as its form collapsed inward, disappearing into the glowing symbols. The room shook violently, and then, as suddenly as it had begun, everything went still. The candles flickered out, plunging the room into darkness. For a moment, the trio stood frozen, their breaths ragged and their hearts pounding. Then Jake struck a match, relighting one of the candles. The soft glow revealed the room in disarray, but the sigils on the floor remained intact, their light fading slowly but steadily. "Did we do it?" Elliot asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Priya surveyed the room, her gaze lingering on the sigils. "I think so," she said, though her tone was cautious. "The seal is holding. For now." Jake sank to the floor, his hands trembling as he closed Lydia's journal. "It's over," he said, though he couldn't shake the feeling that their victory came at a cost they didn't yet understand. As they left room 42, the oppressive weight in the air seemed to lift slightly. But the echoes of the entity's presence lingered, a haunting reminder that some forces are never truly vanquished, they are merely contained, waiting for the next crack in the seal. As they left room 42, the trio couldn't shake the oppressive silence that followed them out. Though the sigils seemed to hold and the entity had been banished back into the void, something about the atmosphere felt incomplete, as if the room itself still bore traces of what had transpired. Priya glanced at Jake, who clutched Lydia's journal tightly against his chest, and Elliot, whose pale face betrayed the same lingering unease she felt. "Let's take a minute," Priya suggested, leading them to the stairwell. The cold stone steps offered a momentary reprieve from the oppressive energy of room 42. Elliot collapsed onto the steps, his crowbar clanging noisily as he dropped it. "I don't get it," he muttered, rubbing his temples. "We did everything the journal said. We finished the ritual. So why doesn't it feel like we've won?" Jake leaned against the wall, his expression grim. "Because we didn't win. Not completely. The entity is bound, but the seal is still temporary. Lydia's journal, it's missing something. There has to be a final step we're not seeing." Priya frowned, flipping through the journal once more. The glow from the sigils had faded, but faint traces of energy still radiated from its pages. The seal might hold for now, but if the entity broke free once, it can do it again. "We need to ensure it's locked away permanently. And how exactly do we do that?" Elliot asked, his voice tinged with frustration. "Do we have to dig up another chapel? Find some ancient artifact? Maybe summon an even bigger monster to fight this one?" Jake shook his head. "No. I think the answer has been here all along." The trio returned to the library the next day, exhaustion etched into their faces. Mrs. Duval raised an eyebrow as they approached her desk, her concern evident. "You all look like you've seen a ghost," she said, though her tone lacked its usual levity. "I take it room 42 hasn't been kind to you." Jake hesitated before responding. "We need to look at the oldest records you have. Anything about Blackwood boarding school, the chapel, or rituals performed there. We're missing a piece of the puzzle." Mrs. Duval studied them for a moment before nodding. "Follow me." She led them to a restricted section of the archives, where rows of dusty, leather-bound volumes awaited. Among them was a ledger labeled Blackwood Chapel, Ritual Records. Priya carefully opened it, revealing faded entries written in meticulous handwriting. One passage immediately caught their attention. To seal the doorway permanently, the guardian must make the ultimate sacrifice. Only through the binding of life to the seal can the shadow be contained for eternity. Elliot's voice broke the heavy silence. "Sacrifice? That can't mean what I think it means, right?" Priya's hands trembled as she read the passage again. "It explains everything. Lydia wasn't just performing the ritual to bind the entity, she was trying to become the seal. That's why she disappeared. Jake's throat tightened. She gave her life to keep it contained. And when the seal weakened, the entity broke free. Elliot stood abruptly, pacing the length of the room. No, absolutely not. We're not doing this. There has to be another way. Priya's voice was barely above a whisper. If there was, Lydia would have found it. As night fell, the trio returned to room 42 one final time. The room was eerily calm, the faint glow of the sigils the only indication of the battle that had taken place. Jake placed the journal on the desk, his resolve hardening with each passing moment. If this is the only way to stop it, Jake said, his voice steady, then I'll do it. No, Priya said firmly, stepping forward. We'll find another way. We'll keep researching, keep fighting. We've come this far together. We're not losing you now. Jake looked at her, his expression softening. If we don't do this, the entity will break free again. And next time, it won't just be us. It'll be the entire campus, maybe even more. We can't take that risk. Elliot placed a hand on Jake's shoulder. We'll do this together. If Lydia's journal taught us anything, it's that no one should face this alone. They prepared for the final ritual with a solemn determination, each of them taking on a role. Jake stood at the center of the circle, his voice carrying the chant that would bind the seal. Priya reinforced the sigils, her hands steady despite the fear coursing through her. Elliot maintained the protective barrier, ensuring the salt line remained intact. The room reacted immediately, the sigils flaring brighter than ever before. The whispers returned, their tone now desperate and pleading. The entity materialized once more, its form larger and more defined, its glowing eyes fixed on Jake. You cannot bind me, the entity roared, its voice shaking the walls. You will fail, as she did. Jake ignored the taunts, his focus unwavering. He recited the chant with a power that seemed to resonate from the very walls of the room. The sigils pulsed in response, their light creating a barrier that forced the entity back. Priya stepped forward, her voice joining Jake's as she recited a secondary chant. The entity howled in fury, its tendrils lashing out at the barrier with renewed intensity. Elliot swung his crowbar at a tendril that came too close, scattering its shadowy form. We're almost there, Priya shouted. Keep going. Jake's voice rose, the final lines of the chant echoing through the room. The sigils flared with blinding light, and the entity let out a deafening scream as its form began to disintegrate. The room shook violently, and for a moment, it felt as though the entire building might collapse. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, the chaos ceased. The entity's form vanished, leaving only the faint glow of the sigils on the floor. The whispers fell silent, and the oppressive weight in the air lifted. Jake collapsed to his knees, his breath ragged. Priya and Elliot rushed to his side, their faces etched with concern. Did it work? Priya asked, her voice trembling. Jake looked at the sigils, their light fading but steady. It's done, he said. The seal is complete. Elliot sank to the floor, his crowbar clattering beside him. Let's never do that again. Priya managed a weak smile, tears streaming down her face. We did it. We actually did it. As they left room 42 for the final time, the oppressive energy that had plagued the space was gone. The room felt normal. But they knew the price of their victory, and the memory of Lydia's sacrifice would stay with them forever. In the weeks that followed, the trio tried to return to normal life. But the events of room 42 left an indelible mark on them. Priya continued researching paranormal phenomena, determined to honor Lydia's legacy by helping others. Elliot, though reluctant at first, joined her efforts, his skepticism tempered by their shared experience. Jake kept Lydia's journal, a reminder of the strength it took to face the darkness and the sacrifices made to keep it at bay. Though room 42 was no longer haunted, the echoes of their ordeal lingered in their minds, a testament to the thin line between light and shadow. And somewhere, deep within the seal, the entity remained bound but waiting, its whispers silenced for now, but never truly gone. The morning light streamed through the tall windows of Winchester Hall, bathing the corridors in a warm, golden glow that felt almost foreign after the harrowing events of the previous nights. For the first time since their ordeal began, Jake, Priya, and Elliot felt a sense of calm, though it was tinged with exhaustion and lingering unease. Room 42, once a source of dread and mystery, now stood silent, its oppressive energy dissipated. The trio gathered in the small common area just outside the dormitory. Priya clutched a thermos of coffee, her hands trembling slightly from the adrenaline crash. Elliot sat on a worn couch, his crowbar leaning against the wall beside him. Jake leaned against the window, Lydia's journal in his hands, its pages weathered but still intact. "We did it," Priya said softly, her voice carrying a mixture of relief and disbelief. "The seal held. The entity is bound." "For now," Jake replied, his gaze distant as he flipped through the journal. "But we can't pretend this is over. Lydia's sacrifice kept it at bay for a century, but if the seal weakens again..." Elliot groaned, running a hand through his hair. "Can we not talk about the seal breaking? Just for one day? I need at least 24 hours without thinking about shadow monsters." Priya gave a weak chuckle. "Fair enough. I think we've earned a break." Jake closed the journal and placed it on the table between them. "We've also earned the truth. Lydia gave her life to protect this campus, and no one even remembers her. That has to change." Over the next few days, the trio worked to piece together Lydia's story, determined to honor her legacy. They combed through the university's archives, filling in the gaps left by the journal. They uncovered records of her time at Blackwood boarding school, her involvement in the mysterious rituals, and the fire that ultimately claimed her life. Priya wrote a detailed account of their findings, combining historical records with their own experiences. She presented it to the campus historian, who was initially skeptical but eventually agreed to include Lydia's story in the university's official records. A small plaque was commissioned and placed outside room 42, commemorating Lydia Harlow's bravery and the sacrifices she made to protect others. Elliot, though still wary of anything remotely paranormal, surprised Jake and Priya by suggesting they create a digital archive of their findings. "If something like this ever happens again," he explained, "people need to know what they're dealing with." The digital archive became a collaborative effort, with Jake scanning pages from Lydia's journal and Priya recording their own first-hand accounts. Elliot, ever the tech-savvy skeptic, created a secure website to house the information, complete with warnings about the dangers of tampering with the seal. Life slowly began to return to normal, though the trio found themselves forever changed by their experiences. Priya continued her studies in psychology, focusing on trauma and resilience. She found herself drawn to cases involving unexplained phenomena, offering support to those who had faced the unknown. Elliot threw himself into his engineering coursework, channeling his lingering fear into projects that gave him a sense of control. Though he often joked about their ordeal, it was clear that the experience had left a lasting impression on him. Jake, however, struggled to move on. He carried Lydia's journal with him everywhere, unable to shake the feeling that their fight wasn't truly over. He spent countless nights poring over the journal's pages, searching for clues about the entity and its origins. The more he read, the more questions he uncovered. One evening, as Jake sat alone in his dorm room, Priya and Elliot stopped by unannounced. They found him surrounded by books and notes, his eyes red from lack of sleep. "Jake," Priya said gently, placing a hand on his shoulder. "You need to give yourself a break. We did everything we could. The seal is holding." Jake shook his head, his voice tinged with frustration. "But for how long? We don't know what's out there, waiting for another chance to break through. We barely survived this time. What if?" Elliot interrupted him. "What if we spend the rest of our lives looking over our shoulders? What if we let this thing take away everything we've worked for? That's not living, Jake. That's letting it win." Priya nodded. "We'll always be ready if something happens. But right now, we need to live our lives. That's what Lydia would have wanted." Jake hesitated, then sighed deeply. "You're right. I can't shake the feeling that this isn't over." "It's not," Priya said with a small smile. "But that doesn't mean we can't take a break. We've earned it." The trio decided to mark the end of their ordeal with a visit to Blackwood Grove, the site of the old boarding school. The grove was quiet, its ancient trees standing as silent witnesses to the events that had unfolded there. They placed a small bouquet of flowers at the base of a tree near the grove's edge, a gesture of gratitude to Lydia and a reminder of the sacrifices made to protect their world. As they stood in the grove, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows across the ground, Jake felt a sense of peace for the first time in weeks. The whispers were gone, the oppressive weight lifted. For now, the seal held. "Do you think she's at peace?" Elliot asked, breaking the silence. Priya nodded. "I think so. We made sure her story won't be forgotten. That's all she ever wanted." Jake looked at the flowers, his expression thoughtful. "And if the seal ever breaks again?" Priya placed a reassuring hand on his arm. "Then we'll be ready."